Good evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this year's launch of the British Academy Book Prize for Global Cultural Understanding. I'm Patrick Wright. I'm a fellow of the British Academy and chair of the Book Prize jury, and I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Sujit Sivasundaram. Sujit is Professor of World History at the University of Cambridge, and he's here to talk with us as author of the book that won the prize last year in 2021. That is Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire, published by William Collins in the United Kingdom and by the University of Chicago Press in the USA. Now in its 10th year, our annual prize, which awards £25,000 to the winner, is the British Academy's way of recognising the enormous contribution non-fiction authors from around the world make to improving public understanding of world culture and their world cultures and their intersection, beneficial or highly problematic as that may be. In 2022, we'll be awarding the 10th book prize. So once again, the panel of judges is seeking books that combine rigorous, original, and high quality research with a concern to be accessible and engaging as well as informative to read. Nominations for the 2022 round of the British Academy Book Prize are now open, and the submission deadline is 31st of March. A shortlist of up to 6 books will be announced in September, and the winner of the 2022 prize will be announced in October. Please visit the British Academy's website for further details on the criteria and how to nominate a title. A link will also be made available in the chat and at the end of this event. This evening, over the next 30 or 40 minutes or so, we're going to explore with Sujit how his book illuminates the interconnection and divisions that shape our global cultural identity. Towards the end of the event, we will take questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Sujit, welcome, and perhaps I can start by asking you how Waves Across the South came to be written, since your previous book was focused on Sri Lanka and was written over, an interesting but less broad canvas.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you, Patrick, for your role as chair, and Madhuri and Catherine and Fatima and Philip for your careful work as judges, the really excellent shortlist, and it was an honor to be on the shortlist. And finally, of course, to be awarded this prize, which was a huge surprise. So I've not met many of the judges, and the one I have met, I've never had the chance for a long conversation with. So when I met Patrick for the first time for lunch last week, I said I felt especially happy to be awarded a prize by people I don't already know. And I'm also especially glad about the kind of work that the prize is highlighting, and in turn the space that this opens up for further writing from the Global South, which decenters or responds to the books that have been highlighted by the work of the judges. So yes, the relationship between my previous work and this work, the previous book that I wrote was Islanded, and it was on the same period as Waves Across the South. It was on the late 18th and the early 19th century, and I was interested in the advent of wholesale British colonization to the island of Sri Lanka, where I grew up. Now, I use the term colonization there advisedly because this was a crown colony set apart from the territories of the East India Company in mainland India, and Indian observers often refer to the island as, in the period, a colony. So what I was interested in really is how that kind of idea of this separable island colony got tied up to notions of race, Sinhalese-ness, which is still the majority ethnicity on the island, to notions of heritage, Buddhism, to notions of language, to notions of romanticism, Orientalism, science, and so forth. And I guess the sort of general framework was really that a small island like Sri Lanka was a critical space for the beginnings of this British colonial enterprise, and that we could learn a lot from a small space, which had been at the margins of South Asian history, which is often dominated by the mainland and by North India and by Bengal and places like this. So it's that perspective of centering unusual places that I brought into Waves Across the South, which, Patrick, as you say, has a much wider canvas than one island.
Now, your historical period is the age of revolution and empire. I mean, this is a phrase we know partly from historians like Hobsbawm long ago now, but it's also a phrase that, you know, could seem problematic if viewed from the from the perspectives of the South, from the particularly the perspectives of indigeneity. And it seems interesting to me that you've, in a sense, maintained that perspective. I mean, what is it about the idea of the age of revolution and empire that you need to carry with you to conduct this analysis?
Yeah, sure. So it's an experiment in a particular kind of world history, this book. And we know, of course, that the age of revolutions has meant a certain sequence of things like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and Latin American independence movements through the work of Hobsbawm, certainly through the work of R.R. Palmer, but also a whole generation of Atlantic historians who've taken that story to the Caribbean, to West Africa, to ships and sailors crossing the Atlantic as well. So it's a really vibrant field, this field of the Age of Revolutions, but it's a Euro-Atlantic field. And since I have worked on this period for a long time, the late 18th century and the early 19th century, which is a consequential period for the origins of the modern world, I wanted to take the concept to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And as I say in the book, to critically repopulate it, meaning to actually sort of populate it with indigenous perspectives and indigenous peoples and their histories. So really, if I'm to define the Age of Revolutions here, it's about the presence, about the assertion, about the resistance, about the associations between indigenous peoples in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and how all of that then meets this imperial moment, which is European, and then particularly British as we go through the decades of the 19th century. So it's a sort of meeting really of indigenous revolutionary potential and practice with counter-revolutionary imperialism. Now, I said earlier that it's an experiment, and I don't advocate that everyone who does world history or global South scholarship should do this. But my perspective is that actually a term like the Age of Revolutions shouldn't be left to Europeanists and Atlanticists alone. That we should, like indigenous peoples do in the story that I tell, that we should take from Europe these concepts and then redefine them and make them anew from the global South, so that the scholarship of the global South can speak to that of the global North in a critical fashion. So that was really why it was an experiment.
I think one of the things that the judges liked about the book was people were surprised by how successfully you managed to establish that the idea of revolution is taken up and reformulated. I mean, there is communication between the Atlantic Revolution, as you describe, and those that you find in Maori lands, in Burma, and there are all sorts of points where you see people making revolution, and then you see the British Empire as not just a kind of, well, what it was in many regards, a primitive, extractive, violent thing, but a thing that is actually trying to keep the lid on these revolutionary movements. So it becomes a sort of counter-revolutionary impulse as well as a classically imperialist one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's right. I was really conscious of, yes, the reception of the news of the French Revolution on French voyages in the Pacific, or the reception of the news of the French Revolution in a place like Mauritius. And so the arrival of European news plays a role, but that sort of that package of European ideas is then always recontextualized in relation to local issues, local politics, about the relations between enslaved people and settlers in Mauritius, or between chiefly lines and explorers in the Pacific. And so it's actually kind of attentiveness to those long distance connections, but also really the fundamental significance of local context to the Age of Revolutions, which comes through the book. And so it kind of tracks a series of sites across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, not in an exhaustive fashion, really, but in order to really kind of insist on the particularity of Mauritius or Burma, Myanmar, or Java or Tasmania, and to show how this encounter between revolution and counter-revolution, indigenous and colonial, looked specific in each of those locales in the global South.
I'd like to start with your opening, the sort of content of the book in a way. You have two chapters at the beginning which are dealing with the Pacific. They're dealing with places like Tonga and over into New Zealand and Australia and the islands, Fiji. But mostly they're about boats. I mean, you say it early on in the book that one of the things that's characteristic of imperialism in these seas is that they are seas. They're watery, they're wet, they're unstable, they're full of bad weather systems, they're unknowable. And the boat becomes the vehicle of imperialism. It becomes the vehicle of encounter and of exploitation and of trade and all those things. Now, the boats you describe are really extraordinary worlds, aren't they? I mean, they're unstable, they're insecure, they're liable to attack. I mean, tell us something about why they interested you.
Yeah, so I mean, the broader argument, as I said a minute ago, is about this encounter between indigenous revolutionary culture and the counter-revolutionary imperial project. And both of those things are unpredictable. The meeting generates uncertain outcomes. And so by symmetry, the ship, which is the vehicle of a lot of this story, is also unstable, I would say, right? So because in a sense, the meeting of these structures is unstable. And so the mechanics through which that happens is unstable as well. And that in turn mirrors the environmental context in which all of this is happening, because the waves, which are in the title of the book, Waves Across the South, are the waves of indigenous protest, are the waves or the tsunami of empire. And waves are unstable, they're uncertain, they don't reach completion, they're cyclical. And so it's that sort of dynamic, the environmental context, the platform of the ship, and then the meeting of these structures of revolution and counter-revolution that I wanted to get to. But just to return to the ship, because I can sense that you're interested in the ships, Patrick. Yeah, there are lots of ships in the book, you're right. And that's partly because ships are being used to do all kinds of things in this era of the age of revolution. So they are the means of the expansion of science. In a leaky way, I would say, and I could expand on that. But they are the means of the expansion of science. They're a key vehicle for a key period of naval war, of course. Technical changes are coming in, which make them really, really important for new ways of doing free trade commerce in this era between, say, China and India, or even Australia, set within a triangle between China and India, which is one of the points I make about trade. So for all of those reasons, ships are really, really significant. But they're also extremely unstable. This is the era just prior to the steamship, after all. And so ships can be, tossed into the air on the way to Java, to invade Java, the British invading Java in 1811. They can be shipwrecked and burnt in Tonga, the Port-au-Prince, which features in the book. And everything on the ship can be taken for use in local wars. Or they can be struck by earthquakes, which is what happens by tremors when there are these scientific experiments to determine very precisely the nature of gravity, gravitational acceleration in Southeast Asia, to determine the shape of the Earth, the exact shape of, or the curvature of the Earth, I should say, for free trade commerce. So in a sense, a huge number of things can happen to ships. And so they are unstable. So they're being used in all of these ways for science, for war, for empire, for trade, but they're unstable. And then nature can interfere as well, of course. And because of that, because of the two things, they're being used in these ways and they're unstable, they can become an effective platform for politics. For instance, rebellion or mutiny, or even ship burning as a form of protest. So, so that's in a sense the way the ship comes in. It comes in a specific environmental context, but also as a site of possibility for the story of politics, both imperial and indigenous.
You have an interesting, you talk about something you call maritime capitalism as being another thing that is distinctive about what happens on these seaboards you're describing. And I wondered what that is. I mean, how do because in a sense what you're making is a case for the distinctiveness. If you open the picture of this so-called age of revolution and empire to include the South, you do change what you're seeing. And I think this does, one of the things you're saying is that this is a different sort of capitalism that develops in this.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you picked up on capitalism, because it's something that I should actually say more about. And in a sense, the work I think could be developed further with further attention to capitalism by others. So I guess one way of reading the overall argument is to say that there is a sort of maritime capitalism that sets a template for land-based colonization, which is increasingly, in the period's terms, and this is the word that's used, systematic. So if you think about Aotearoa New Zealand, for instance, the emergence of systematic land-based colonization out of a complex of sealing and whaling and plunder of the seas, as sealers and whalers transition into land-based settlers, often in interracial marriages and so forth, but under kind of Christian baptism, for example. So really maritime capitalism leading into land-based capitalism. And rhetorically, that's about discipline. It's about, getting rid of what's sometimes kind of characterized as a sort of age of slavery here, whaling and sealing, and irregular sort of dispersal of convicts and so forth. So it's a kind of exercise of reform, really, that characterizes the transition from maritime capitalism to land-based capitalism in the story of the age of revolutions. But to make it more complicated, one could argue that there are other modes of accumulation operating in the book. And so since Tonga was mentioned, one could think about the Port-au-Prince, and one could think about that ship that's raided by the Tongans. And one could say that there are indigenous modes of raiding that are really significant here as well, but that these indigenous modes of raiding operate within other cosmologies and other modes of politics. And so there's a sort of disconnect between the maritime capitalism and these other modes of raiding.
It's interesting. I mean, your use of the word raiding is significant, because in the book, what you're basically saying is that the raiding goes two ways. In a sense, we all know that imperialists raid, because that's part of the process in a sense. But what you're saying is that the raiding is coming from the other side all the time. There are people swooping in and taking elements of the sort of English or British idea, say, and turning it into something that becomes their own.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But I think there's a sort of step change in that raiding. So there is raiding on the indigenous side, ideas of monarchy, weapons being taken, muskets, most notably in the book. People, European advisors being taken as refugees of the Napoleonic Wars and so forth, right? So a whole series of things and people are being taken, raided, if you will, for a new kind of politics on the part of the indigenous, on the part of indigenous peoples. But the raiding that's undertaken by the Europeans and by the Brits is sort of leading into this free trade capitalism, which is evolving from the seas to the land. So there's a sort of scalar change, and it's sort of certainly capitalism with a capital C, and it's always moving forward. The frontier is always moving forward. You're always moving across terrain. You're always sort of moving from the water to the land, to the hinterland, to plantations, etc., etc. So there's a sort of geographical expansionism, really, to the story, which makes it distinct, I would argue, to the raiding which is happening in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, if there's a phrase here that you seem to be really focusing on and carrying forward throughout, it is institutional. It is indigenous agency. The book is really making a long case for the indigenous not simply being a world that was disturbed and then cleared or reshaped or remolded or passively sort of was passive in the face of its destruction. You're over and over again, wherever you look in this vast area, you are seeing indigeneity remade in connection with it through its own will, in a sense, in connection with these encounters. So can you tell us what it is you're doing there? Why that term?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's really important to actually think about how indigeneity is being used in the book.
Yeah.
So I would say it's a foregrounding of indigenous peoples in the age of revolutions, and that is a central theme. Yes, it's about agency, and agency occurs in the book at various points, but it's also about association, and it's about resistance, and it's even about indigenous presence in the sense of just being there in a space that is increasingly being whitened by settlers. So the reason I kind of clarify that is because I think there's a danger of focusing only and singularly on agency in this story, because if we just track agency, we just get to individuals, and certainly individuals are reorganizing their selfhood in this story. Abdullah Munshi, who I mentioned, in Singapore, is doing this. He works with Raffles. He's thinking through science and medicine and Islam as a way of really thinking about.
He's writing books about steamships.
Yes, and he uses
Western science. Yeah.
Yeah, and he uses I as a way of kind of talking about himself in the Hikayat Abdullah, right? So there's a sort of definitely a reflection on selfhood and individuality, but too much focus on agency actually makes it simply a story of individuals. And some scholars would critique agency on this precise ground of saying it foregrounds the liberal, free-thinking individual. And what we need to do is to sort of combine that with indigenous peoples in forms of association, or shipboard solidarities, or working in sealing complexes, and so forth. So actually to think about collectives as much as individuals, and then additionally to think about the environment, because in many ways the concept of agency can be too human-centered. And so thinking the sealing complex, it's also about the seals and whales, it's about storms and currents. And so really what we need is, agency works to a certain extent, but we do need association, we do need humans and nature, we do need resistance, we do need protest. I think I try in the book, though it's difficult to use a whole array of terms to talk about indigeneity. But there's another aspect of that question which I'd like to get onto, which is of course that the concept of indigeneity here is being used inclusively to encompass a whole series of people of color, and in sites where actually indigenous peoples are very mobile. So indigenous peoples can be mobile here, and there could be sites where actually there were no indigenous peoples originally. Several sites like that occur in the book. And so what I'm trying to do here is to be inclusive in thinking through the position of colonized people in the global South in order to contest a more narrow conception of the indigenous, which was in keeping with the colonial classificatory project tied, for instance, to race and gender in particular. And that goes back to my Sri Lanka work, by the way, which is where it comes from.
Sujit, you've got to read us a piece, because I'd like to have you the voice in my ear. You've got a piece about Hongi, haven't you? A man that was known briefly as the Maori Napoleon in a patronizing way, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right. That is right. And this comes from the chapter themed on European explorers meeting people across the Pacific. I've been teaching on this material a little bit, and what I usually say is it's in a very simplistic way that the European explorers came along and asked for a monarch, and then indigenous peoples in turn evolved their system of chieftaincy into one of monarchy, because in this period we see the inauguration of monarchic lines across the Pacific. The story here is from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is slightly different to that, and we can talk about that later, but let me just read, which is, I think, what I'm supposed to do. The so-called Maori Napoleon, inverted commas, Hongi Hika, 1772 to 1828, was an early initiate to the power of European muskets. Hongi used muskets in the wars between Ngā Puhi and Ngāti Whatua in the Bay of Island district of North Island. As a Maori account holds, Hongi operated within established ways of avenging the wrongs against kin. Quote, the primary reason Hongi set himself up as a war leader, killing people, was the wrongs of former times, that is, the farewell requests concerning them of those who died earlier, which Hongi carried out to honor the words of his ancestors who died. Yet, end quote, Hongi innovated and changed these traditions. Following the Europeans' advice, he grew wheat and corn and potatoes that he could use to buy muskets and gunpowder from arriving vessels. And he put the captives he took in war to work on these plantations. As a result of these wars and the interplay of new and old, Hongi's people came increasingly to refer to themselves using a larger collective name, Ngā Puhi. Hongi created quite a stir when he arrived in London in 1820, accompanied by the evangelical Thomas Kendall and an aide, Waikato. Global travel supercharged Maori customary practice. Tellingly, he was presented to the British monarch, George IV. He allegedly observed, there is only one king in England. There shall be only one king in New Zealand. He also spent some time at the University of Cambridge, was entertained by the Vice-Chancellor, and helped create a Maori dictionary. In the oral tradition of his descendants, he is said to have taken a great interest in maps of the Napoleonic Wars, deposited in Cambridge. A representation of Hongi's face had arrived in England prior to his person one MP wrote of Hongi's appearance in the House of Lords and compared his face to a carved specimen. And I should just add that this next bit is racialized. I went round, the MP, and got near enough to touch His Majesty when I found his royal face to be one of the very finest specimens of carving I have ever beheld. The Chamberlain's face, by Cato, was fair, the sunflowers on it were highly respectable, but the king's nose, which surpassed the average size, was one blaze of stars and planets. When he returned to New Zealand, the fact that he came with gifts and patronage and a personal bond with the British Crown allowed him to immediately mount a series of campaigns to consolidate his power. He traded many of his presents in Sydney on the way to New Zealand, preferring muskets, powder, and shot. He had hundreds of muskets in his possession when he returned to New Zealand. He retained a suit of armor, which was presented to him. The spread of armament, political consolidation, and notions of community then arose at the intersection of Maori traditions and British imperialism in a mutually reinforcing dynamic. Such a dynamic was evident with respect to the interpretation of Hongi's face. It was a product of Maori carving as much as European notions of race. Thank you.
Excellent. And this is you know, in a sense, you've got many examples of this. You've got this figure moving absolutely from the so-called periphery to the very center. He's in a London that is used to exhibiting, you know, imperialized peoples as sort of specimens. It's a painful kind of encounter, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally painful. And I mean, of course, this happens leading into the Treaty of Waitangi, which continues to be contested in Aotearoa New Zealand, and which is interpreted by the British as a deed of cessation. So in a sense, what's happening is that this trade in muskets generates these modes of war, which are a stitching together of Maori custom with European technique. And then they lead into more kind of wholesale colonization, arguably, and then finally into the Kingitanga movement, which is a movement of resistance to the take-up of land, ancestral land, by the British. So really, I guess the broader story is about the consolidation of notions of monarchy across the Pacific, into which this particular episode fits. But what I'm trying to highlight is that it connects to the Age of Revolutions with respect to muskets, with respect to race, and also with respect to really an exploration with new political forms.
How does this develop over the period you're dealing with? I mean, much of what we're talking about is quite early at this point. I mean, I suppose 1820s is sort of midway in your period. Your Age of Revolution sort of ends in round about 1848, doesn't it? I mean, what's happening at the latter end of this period? I mean, are things different? Is it changing? Are different forms of intersection happening?
Yeah, so the book, of course, goes up to 1848, and the last chapter ends with 1848 across the Southwest Indian Ocean between Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Cape. So there's no end to this story in some ways, because though there is this encounter between indigenous revolutionary potential and counter-revolutionary imperialism, one could argue that indigenous presence and resistance and association and agency isn't totally wiped out ever, though it's folded into the imperial project. So it kind of carries through into the 19th century, through the 19th century. Similarly, one could argue that empire is firming up, more land is being taken, but it is constantly sort of liable to fail as well. And so really, it's the sort of completion of the sort of story which interests me. And so I wouldn't say that there is a final kind of end in 1848. However, one could argue that when you go into the 1830s and the 1840s, what you're getting is demographic expansion. So one of the points I make is really about the explosion of cities, for instance, in the Indian Ocean world, and cities which then need to come to terms with some of the debates of the earlier decades about who belongs and who doesn't belong, and who gets the right to write to this particular newspaper and not that particular newspaper. So cities are characterized by really virulent debates in the press, and those debates can then reflect on modes of rebellion and resistance in that era as well. So really you're getting the first stirrings really of what could be called a kind of public through the story of the 1830s and the 1840s. And one particular aspect of that is, of course, the question of labor, which I argue features very heavily in 1848 across the Southwest Indian Ocean, because one could argue that earlier debates about abolition, in as much as about who belongs and who doesn't belong, keep reverberating into 1848 in determining who gets the right to vote, who should be represented, and so forth. So that, in a sense, once again, that there's a thread that runs through these decades into the 19th century. The story isn't finished, but you can see that there are these changes in relation to where these questions are being worked out in new associations through newspapers and also through a culture of exchange across the Indian Ocean, now supercharged by the steamship.
And how, you mentioned abolition, let's just pause on that. How does that get configured in your world, the South? I mean, it's obviously not 1848, it's earlier, but I mean, presumably when slavery is abolished within the British Empire, that has consequences that will be particular in the world you're describing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's actually the case that abolition is a never completed project in this world. And then it is used as a way of targeting other modes of, other sorts of practice. So in a sense, you know, the language of anti-slavery then becomes associated with modes of reform directed towards, say, the seal trade. It becomes connected to modes of reform directed towards certain cultural practices in South Asia as well. So effectively, it's this never completed project which continues to have reverberations into really late into the middle into 1848, certainly, I would argue. And so that is one way to think about it, really. It's never complete and it continues to reverberate. And of course, the story of indenture comes into this, especially for the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, where new modes of coarse labor fill the gap that's opened up in places like Mauritius, for instance, which are early sites for, and Sri Lanka as well, for experimenting with indenture. So I guess there's a sort of intersection between this later history and the earlier history, and it's the incompletion of abolition, which is really striking.
Good. Sujit, you have another reading, which I think we should try and fit in before we come to the end of our discussion. This is not in London, it's somewhere else, isn't it? It's a different passage altogether.
Yeah, it's from Sri Lanka, actually, and it's about war. So each of the chapters of the book is themed on a particular topic. The bit I read earlier was on cultural encounter or maritime exploration. This one is a later chapter, and it's about war and war in the Bay of Bengal. So the chapter juxtaposes Sri Lanka next to Burma, Myanmar, next to Java, the invasion of Java by the British, and really argues that there's a sort of maritime context to these wars, and that many people involved with the Napoleonic Wars take up arms here as well. So the section, as I say, is about the war of 1803 in Sri Lanka. The Ingrisi Hatana is a palm leaf poem written in honor of the Kandyan king's victory against the British in 1803. It's likely to have been written in sections over a period from around 1805 onwards. It's perhaps a transcription of an oral ballad performed before the king. It is a gory celebration of victory, replete with details of the smashing of British bodies. But this violence is not unlike that enacted by the British in their total wars against colonial opponents in this period. On the departure of the forces from the British, from Colombo on the coast to the kingdom in the interior of the island in Kandy, the poet notes, with the booming sounds of gunfire and the sounds of five-fold musical instruments bearing parasols, flags, etc., the English soldiers set out from Colombo, riding palanquins and horses. On the taking of the deserted city of Kandy by the British, there is the following commentary. The idiotic British, having seen Sinhalese forces thus retreating from the city, entered the city like a herd of cattle that rushed into a deserted field from which the farmers had taken away all the grain. The way they took up residence in the city, having crossed the river, shows that they are doomed to be food for crows, dogs, and foxes. The portrayal of British techniques of war as without wisdom and British conduct as greedy and plundering is contrasted with the tasteful procession of the king and his troops. Many different elephants, quote, that roar violently like the roll of thunder in the battlefield, who look like the clouds moving on the earth, and who touch the ground with 7 parts of their bodies. Lines of horses on either side of the road looking like waves in the milky ocean. Look, they have prevented the sun, the king's forces, from shining on the earth with the clouds of dust they stir when they run. Thus the sound of the wheels of horse-drawn carriages filled the air, while some soldiers took shields with swords, arrows, and bows, and spars, wearing glittering armor as the fourfold forces got ready in this manner.
Very nice. Very nice. I don't know this poem at all, but maybe most of us don't. So, Sujit, we're running close on time, but I would like to sort of bring you into the present a little bit and just ask you to reflect upon what all this means to us now. And I suppose partly what I'm thinking of is the argument that the Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh made quite recently in a book called The Great Derangement. He was saying that, and this your book reminded me a lot of this, that what the British Empire did in this part of the world was create a situation where the sea mattered greatly. Everything was about trade, everything was about power through the water. And the consequence of this is that huge cities developed in areas which are now absolutely faced with global warming and with rising sea levels. Now, of course, in Britain, we've got the same problem with our ports, but it's a few towns like Sheerness and Portsmouth that are dealing with it. But in your part of the world, if I can, part of your world described in your book, this is a huge, huge issue, a big, big problem. And I wondered, you know, I mean, throughout this book, you are there as a person wandering about. You're there noticing plastic drifting up on the shore. I mean, how do you see the present implications of this research you've done?
Yes, there are multiple, ways in which I could answer that question, but let me sort of take up the environmental aspect because that kind of fits with Amitav Ghosh's work. And I'm just kind of finished reading Nutmeg's Curse, which is the more recent one as well. So one could argue that there's a fundamental change, and this is something that I say in the book, in attitudes to nature in this era. So in addition to warfare and exploration, science is a theme of the book. And what I say about it is that really the planet as a whole is being plotted in new ways because data collecting is so vital to the surveillance regime of the Age of Revolutions. It's partly for war, but it's also because nature is being converted into resource and is being exploited in new ways in this era, which is highly empiricist after all. So, and which gives rise to new forms of science, new scientific disciplines in turn, which are data collecting out in the field like this, because it's possible now to kind of collect fossils in Central India or weather measurements in Southeast Asia. So really we're now at the end of that arc, one could argue. We're at the end of this sort of counter-revolutionary project of making the planet a model, which is what's happening here, which you can manipulate in certain ways, and where you can plot imperial progress as well as a whole series of plantations in the Indian Ocean, for instance. And so what we need then is actually to sort of think about the other side of the story, which is the indigenous side of the story, because one could argue that indigenous peoples have very different conceptions of nature and sustainability, and that it is in island societies that we might find some of the answers really for how to live again with nature and how to really sort of conceive of human agency, to go back to your earlier question, Patrick, as more distributed as well, together with nature. So I think really sort of there are two ways we can sort of reflect on the sort of imperial program and its relationship to nature, and yeah, plastic being the end of that story, but also really the indigenous side and the potentiality of indigenous thought really for our present moment, which is again Amitav's point. It's not a new point. Amitav Ghosh makes the same point about indigenous knowledge. So those would be two ways of responding. But I did want to kind of just put a coda on that, which is actually, I've just been talking about war, and there's a lot of looting going on. So it's not only the looting of nature, it's also the looting of objects and other forms of knowledge. So these wars, including the Kandyan wars, which Kandy eventually falls, Burma, Myanmar, the Kingdom of Ava falls, and there's a lot of looting that goes on in this story as well. And a lot of that stuff ends up certainly in Britain as well. So that, you know, one could think not simply about the environmental legacies of this story, but really the long consequences of colonial war and the cultural footprint that has arisen as a result of that in our museums, for instance. So, but that's, I'm going off.
It's great. I mean, I think as you talk, I think really what your book is doing partly is you're involved in a process of sort of uncancelling an area of the world, a whole range of experience that is somehow still not as in the record and as in our imaginations, certainly perhaps in the West, as it should be. You know, so that seems to me to be a fine project. And I should say again that for all the judges, I mean, we were totally impressed with the way you pulled all this material together and yet managed to produce an argument that kept building and developing, despite the sort of reiteration of stories that could have seemed similar if one only saw them through an abstract theory of power and the people or whatever. I mean, so the subtleties of the book are really impressive and interesting and encouraging too. So thank you. Sujit, I'm going to take the first question. We've got some here. One is, and I can't, sorry, I can't name where they're coming from, but I'll read them out. Does this new history of revolution and empire also help to make sense of the plastic pollution and vulnerability to rising oceans or extreme weather in small island states? We've been there.
Yeah, that sort of kind of goes back to the question you asked me as well. No, certainly, I think that's right. The section that Patrick refers to is a sort of code, is a sort of afterword at the end of the book where I'm looking at the plastic in. I do refer to the plastic in Tonga, I think, but I'm actually the afterwards based in Mauritius, where I just reflect on, in a sense, how the cultivation system has carried on. I mean, if you go to Mauritius, some of the same families are still running the plantations, really. And it's incredible to think that the Age of Revolution story is still, sugar is still everywhere, is intact. And so there's all this worry about pollution and the seas are being polluted by some of the chemicals, etc. So really, yes, the story does relate to the environmental challenges of today. And if one travels through these regions, I mean, Tonga, for instance, which I was in, and I was really worried watching the images recently of that tsunami, but really the vulnerability to rising sea levels is extreme there. Tsunami warnings, you get signs for tsunami warnings on the show, which is partly perhaps why there weren't more casualties. Yes, absolutely, it does run from, there is a connection, I would argue, because we're at the end of that project of exploitation and surveillance and militarization of the Age of Revolutions.
Good, and I have a question here from Madawi. Yes, no, sorry, this is from Jane. We're coming to Madawi. To what extent did caste and or class in colonized countries affect the idea of indigenous agency?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I actually was wondering about answering Patrick's question a bit like that as well. So one of the things I tried to do, I mean, this is another reason why I'm a bit worried about simply sort of saying that the book is about agency, is that in writing the chapters, I tried to continually decenter elites. So in a sense, I began the chapter on the Tasman Sea, I think, with Cora and Bangaree. Not that they're elites, but they're iconic figures in Australian history. But then I moved to the North Shore of Tasmania and talked about Aboriginal women sealing, etc. So in a sense to decent, and then to the seals themselves and what role they were playing in the story. So to continually decenter was just something I tried to do in writing the book. It was difficult because you had to kind of carry on changing the vista. In the Gulf chapter, similarly, to kind of move from elite Parsi shipbuilders who are sometimes classed as sub-imperialists and who certainly, yes, are socially mobile and attentive to class, Jane, to so-called Lascars and enslaved peoples on ships between Arabia and Bombay. So in a sense, to try and get that social width, because inevitably the sources are greater for certain iconic and charismatic figures and elites, but they can lead into a bigger sort of wider history And so one just needs to sort of carry on doing that. And it presumably doesn't finish because other people will have to do more of it in other ways. So I think kind of constantly decentering perspectives and individuals like that is the sort of method that I adopted.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm going straight to the next question, which is from one of my fellow judges, Madawi al-Rashid. I very much enjoyed reading the book. It was a rewarding intellectual journey. My question is, what are the challenges that you encountered writing this book?
Yeah, sure. So this just gives me the chance to say that, I mean, it is based on primary work. So when I started writing it, I thought I should really go to, this is before really we started to think about travel in the ways that we do now. This is sort of in 2010 when I started working on this book, and our views of travel and research have changed substantially, I think. But at that stage, I thought I should really go and write the book or research the book on site. And so I thought, let me just think about the sites I want to go to. And so in a sense, sort of working from the ground up, and that meant actually listening to people, talking to local intellectuals in each of the sites. And I should really say that their work has been really, really significant as well. So it's a book based on primary work, but also secondary work. And some of the secondary work isn't readily available, shockingly, in the West, because, you know, the pamphlets in bookshops in Yangon, Rangoon, or sites like this, but it's amazing that these things are not available in libraries in the West, but that is the case. So really sort of through secondary sources and primary sources and through conversations with scholars in each of these sites. So the challenge really then is, when you've done that, to build up to something which holds together whilst being attentive to particularity and attentive to, you know, Mauritius is not the same place as Sri Lanka by any means, et cetera, et cetera. So that is challenging because it is a global history, but it's not a global history where everything is flat and everything's the same and things just move easily. And that, I think, was a really big challenge. Another challenge, of course, is working across different kinds of sources. Textual and visual and material, and colonial and non-colonial and private sort of individuals of various kinds. And so I guess more broadly in my work, I've tried to work across different sources because, like the source I just read you, which is the Ingrisi Hapna, it's wonderful in many ways because it gives you a different way of thinking about colonial war from the other side. But there's a danger of relying on it only because it can lead into a Sinhalese nationalism. And so one has to decenter a source like that next to the colonial sources. And so to really constantly work across a range of sources and to do that well is difficult. And it's difficult also to keep specific sites alive without folding them all into each other, I guess. Yeah.
Sujit, incidentally, I must say, I didn't mention that the use of visual materials, of paintings, of pictures, of monuments is very interesting and well sustained throughout this book. It produces lots of interesting insights. Another question, though, from Jill Bourne this time, who says, fascinating account. Is there any account of the role of women in the book?
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. So in decentering perspectives, I was really, really keen to think about gender, and there is a whole chapter on race and gender for this reason, where I talk about the intimate politics of the age of revolutions. And that is a theme that I sort of explore, and that's through the Tasman Sea chapter. So it's about the Aboriginal women who, how the gender order at the water's edge was different, and where we had Aboriginal women sealing and fishing. And then we have this maritime complex of European exploration coming through, which is heavily masculine, of course, and where these European ships have so many men who are the explorers, and then trying to sort of identify Aboriginal aids. Bungaree here was the man, who are then equally masculine. Bungaree's portrait so many times in the gear of the Age of Revolutions, discarded sort of naval clothes and so forth. So really sort of the changes, so that there is a sort of argument about gender and how gender is changing, and that we need to keep that alive. Of course, I mean, we know that the maritime world is heavily masculinized. And so there's a sort of, I think, and this is something I have wondered about working on more, one could think about the masculinization of the story as well as a sort of gender, as a sort of gendered one. And what happens, say, to the Asian sailor the so-called Lasker, who is cast as effeminate in this period and who's doing a lot of the work and who turns up right across the story. What does it mean? And why is the suicide rate amongst Asian sailors very high? Which is something I haven't written about, but it came up in the archival work. So there are ways in which one could think about gender, and certainly about bringing in the perspectives of a whole range of genders, but also about the pressures that are faced to sort of by people because of the way they're stereotyped vis-a-vis gender.
Sujit, this is question 5, I believe. On your wiki page, it says that you hated studying history at school. I'll share that with you. I didn't even get the answer. What turned you on? This is serious though. What turned you on to enjoying and writing about history?
Well, I have not interfered in any way in that wiki. I mean, I've actually sort of stayed aloof from that wiki entry because there are a lot of things I don't like about it. But anyway, since you cite it as a source, yeah, I mean, I grew up in Sri Lanka, and history was taught in a particular way. It's a very kind of, as everyone or some people might know, it's a heavily nationalized place, and where history supports a majoritarian sort of culture of ethnicity and politics. And so to kind of like history when you're issued a government textbook and you've got to memorize all of it is quite difficult. And so I guess that's sort of just a very simple answer to the question of why I hated history. But I guess
maybe enjoying isn't quite what you do. I mean, maybe you've got a sense of responsibility for understanding the world we're in, and enjoyment is part of that, but something else came in perhaps to lead you.
Yeah, I kind of realized that it's not really about memorizing things. So it's not about rote learning, and I think various people from the global south would say that that takes a sort of bit of time to kind of realize that about history, and that there are ways that you can actually be creative as a historian, which is a bit of a realization. So once I kind of realized that, then I felt that yes, there is a sort of responsibility, but it's also a way of imagining other possibilities politically, and working towards those.
Good. Philip Mead has a question for you. As you use waves as a metaphor for different themes, how would you apply this to the impact of migration during the revolutionary period? And was it an accelerant or of change?
Was the wave an accelerant, or was migration?
I think, yeah. The impact of migration during the revolutionary period, and was it an accelerant of change? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I don't really there isn't a chapter on migration. But I think I say somewhere that, yeah, there are more ships and there are more people on the move, and there definitely is an acceleration in settlement figures, for instance. There's an acceleration of exchange between certain sites in the story, hence the expansion of cities. So one could say, yeah, that migration is accelerating. On waves, yeah, I suppose the thing that comes to mind is some of the images at the start of the book, where you get those ships coming into Chennai, Madras, and there's a big surf in the images. In colonial Madras, there is a big surf. And so you get these people actually getting off their big ships and then being taken in various small boats to the shore, and all kinds of things can go wrong. And I'm interested really in migration, but in that specific space of migration, of kind of what happens when you go from the sea to the land, and all the things that can go wrong because of the waves. What I mean by this is that migration, there are challenges to migrants, and one shouldn't assume that it just gets easier and easier and smoother. There are modes of belonging, not belonging, the beach itself can be a sort of barrier in various ways. Quarantine regimes and so forth could be brought into the picture given our present concerns. Yeah, that's probably enough on that question.
Good. Well, we've actually arrived at our last question. Sujit, this doesn't have a name attached to it. What non-fiction book would you give a prize to? Would you give a prize to, and why?
Well, Patrick and I were discussing Amitav Ghosh, and so that's the first thing that comes to mind. And I've kind of recommended it to various people as something to read. Amitav Ghosh's Nutmeg's Curse, which just came out, which I couldn't put it down. It's really, really gripping. It's about genocide. It's about the plantation system, and about the environmental crisis that sort of emerges out of early modern plantations. And it takes in migration as well as a key theme, our migration crisis and its relationship to climate. So yeah, there we go.
Amitav Ghosh is particularly interesting because he's a novelist who has recently decided that the critical crises of our times are not well handled by the novel. So he's writing non-fiction himself.
So interesting, so interesting. I was a bit worried about the transition, but actually I think it's worked out really well from fiction to non-fiction.
Yeah, no, excellent. Well, thank you very much for those questions. And a huge thank you also to Sujit for such compelling reflections on his book, Waves Across the South. Our congratulations again on winning the 2021 Book Prize. Thank you all for attending, and do please consider non-fiction books that you might want to nominate for the 2022 British Academy Book Prize. Good night.
Thank you.